Chapter 18 ends with Abraham's intercession on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. He bargained with God that if 10 righteous people could be found in Sodom, well, the city would be spared God's judgment. As we come to chapter 19, we face a sobering fact. Not even 10 were found. Only 4 people were exempt from judgment, and even they were so badly compromised they barely escaped. Not because of a lack of mercy or righteousness on God's part, but because they were reluctant to leave. About 15 years before the events of this chapter, Sodom and Gomorrah were conquered and sacked by an alliance of 4 kings from the region of Mesopotamia. Abraham gathered his men and some Amorite allies and went after the retreating force and caught them. Though they were outnumbered, they regained all of the goods taken as spoil, and Abraham rescued his nephew Lot, who'd been taken as one of the hostages. Now, it had to be obvious to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah that Abraham had saved, that their deliverance was a miracle. They'd witnessed Abraham's meeting with Melchizedek, the king priest of Salem, who came out to bless Abraham. They witnessed his worship of the true and living God. Melchizedek was most likely what we call a Christophany, an appearance of God the Son in the Old Testament. The people of Sodom saw him. So get the picture. They'd been captives, miraculously freed by the power of God working through a man of faith in him. They experienced a manifestation of God the Son, if not the actual person, at least a powerful representation of him. And there, as they stood with Abraham before Melchizedek, the defeated king of Sodom shows up and lays claim to them. Salvation was right before them in the following Abraham's example of bowing to Melchizedek, but they foolishly followed their old king back to Sodom. How many people today see God's power and ability to save, but they just shrug it off and go back to their immoral stupor and spiritual bondage? The people of Sodom ought to have taken their defeat at the hands of the Northern Alliance as a warning to seek the Lord. But in the 15 years since, they'd grown even more corrupt and wicked. Well, did the horrific tragedy of 9/11 spark lasting revival in our country, or has our nation grown more wanton and perverse in the last 2 decades? We pick it up at verse 1 of chapter 19. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening. In chapter 18, 3 had appeared to Abraham at his home in Mamre, about 25 miles away. One, of course, was God, who left the other 2, who were angels, to head on to Sodom. They arrived there in the evening. We read on, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face to the ground. Now, because of the way that warfare was conducted in the ancient world, cities had walls to keep out invaders. But of course, to get in and out, they needed gates. Those gates became then the focal point of attackers when they tried to take a city. And so they were the most fortified part of the wall. They weren't a simple wooden door hung on hinges. City gates were an entire complex of rooms with a path that made 1 or 2 90-degree turns so that an invader couldn't rush straight in as soon as the gate was breached. Now, Sodom was a major city, and so its gate complex would have been between about 40 and 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. Here's an artist's reconstruction of the gate complex at Megiddo in northern Israel at the time of Solomon. The city gate was large enough to accommodate a group, and so it became the place where the city's elders would lead. People came there with needs and complaints to have them ruled on. Criminals would be hauled there for judgment. That Lot is sitting in Sodom's gate means that he isn't just living there, he's a leader. And knowing the wickedness of this place, that's disturbing. Maybe he thought that he could be an influence for good. Well, let's see how that turns out. Verse 2. And he said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn in to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, but we will spend the night in the open square." Now, Lot shows the same hospitality to these angelic visitors that Abraham had in the previous chapter. He offers them lodging, refreshment, but they decline, saying that they're going to spend the night in the city square. But Lot knows what goes on after dark in Sodom. There's no way that he wants them subjected to what's likely to happen. Something in their appearance clues Lot into the fact that they are going to be the targets of the men of Sodom's voracious lust. Verse 3. But he, that is Lot, insisted strongly, and so they turned into him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally." So word spread of the more than likely gorgeous hunks that were staying with Lot. A mob gathered at his door, calling them to come out and play. Their intention was clear. They planned to rape them. This isn't a half dozen pervs. It's a huge group. Now, there's a triple abomination in what's going on here. First is the wholesale commitment to homosexuality. Second, they aren't just into consensual sex. They're eager to gang rape Lot's guests. And third, hospitality. That was a sacred virtue in that culture. That's why both Abraham and Lot were swift to welcome and take care of these visitors. Once someone came under your roof, you were duty-bound to protect them. That ought to have applied to these angels the moment they stepped through the gate of Sodom. All the citizens of the city, and especially the men whose sacred assignment it is to protect the innocent, ought to have seen it as their solemn duty to protect them. They instead want to brutalize and victimize them. If the guests had been normal men, as was assumed by the mob, there's no way they'd survive the abuse that was planned for them. Now remember what God told Abraham in the previous chapter. A report of Sodom's wickedness had reached him, and he was going to see if it was as bad as was reported. Well, it turns out to be worse. This is a culture in the last throes of a very ugly death. I live across from a city park. Me taking a walk around the park after dark isn't much of a concern, but there's no way that I'd let a young child play in the park after dark. I'd be supremely uncomfortable with my wife taking a stroll after the sun sets. Lot couldn't stand the thought of his guests being out at night in Sodom because of the threat. He knew the Sodomites were, well, Sodomites, and would see these guys as fresh meat. It wasn't just the presence of sodomy, a synonym for homosexuality, that brought down God's judgment on Sodom. It's that the entire society had given itself over to the pursuit of sin. They will simply not be restrained from going after what their insatiable flesh lusts for. They have become animals. Morality is no longer anywhere on the horizon of their choices. It's only about selfish pleasure now, and that's why time had come for them to be judged by divine wrath. They never will repent. All that's left is for them to victimize more of the innocent before they wipe themselves out. Sodom is a rabid dog, doomed but can inflict a lot of damage before it dies. It's best to, well, put it down. Verse 6, and so Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, "Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly." Well, so far so good. This seems heroic on Lot's part. He goes out to these animals and tries to reason with them. But look at what he's willing to negotiate, verse 8. "See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you. And you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason that they have come under the shadow of my roof." Lot has a twisted sense of morality. He places the call of hospitality above his duty as a father to protect his own virgin daughters. The corruption of Sodom has tweaked Lot's sense of right and wrong. He's lost all moral discernment. This is the danger that we face living in a fallen world. It's the challenge of immersion and influence. Where we spend our time and what we give our attention to, that is what we're immersed in, is going to influence us. It's inevitable. What's repeatedly heard and seen fills our minds and influences our thoughts. On a weekend geology field trip when I was in college, I camped with a couple of young veterans who'd just completed their service, part of it in Vietnam. Now, these 2 guys dropped countless F-bombs. It was an adjective to just about every noun. I ought to have moved to a different campsite, but didn't. I ended up spending the day and an entire night with them. On the long drive home, all alone in my truck, I noticed how my thoughts were peppered by profanity. My internal conversation sounded just like those guys. The next week, I had to make a conscious effort to not drop a few F-bombs myself. If the world that you're immersed in is profane and sensual, materialistic, greedy, envious, carnal, that's going to influence you. 1 Corinthians says, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. That's why it's crucial that we immerse ourselves in the culture and community of the kingdom of God. While you don't have to go to church to be a Christian if you want to be a healthy, growing follower of Jesus, yes, you do. Christians are like spiritual scuba divers where the world is the ocean. A scuba diver breathes air from a tank on his or her back. We draw our life from the Spirit. Just as the diver has to surface regularly to fill their tank, so we need to replenish our supply and by joining with other believers for fellowship, for communion, for encouragement. To counter the influence of the world in which we're immersed, we need to also immerse ourselves in the community of saints where we can be influenced by the grace and the truth of God. One more thing before we move on. As we live in this fallen, God-hating world, it's inevitable that we're going to encounter immorality. You don't have to pursue sin to have it thrust into your face these days. As our society slides further into the gutter, expect immorality to be celebrated and publicly flaunted. We know it already is. It's going to get worse. So let me encourage you to exercise active discernment. What I mean is this. Many people take a passive posture towards the influences of the world. They turn on the TV or the radio, they surf the internet, and whatever's presented, they allow themselves to be entertained by. If we're passively allowing in whatever the world throws at us, our moral discernment will be dulled. It's going to be blunted. We could easily become like Lot, who offered his virgin daughters to these animals. But wait, how many parents are doing that today? They let their sons and their daughters sit in front of a screen. They may not be raping their bodies, but is certainly raping their souls. Social media sites like TikTok exalt immorality and perversion. They push suicidal ideation. Mom and Dad, exercise some active discernment by looking at the world through the filter of God's word and way. When you see or hear something that's wrong, say so out loud. Teach your children how to discern and stand up for what's good by not just passively accepting what's not. Lot was so into Sodom, Sodom had crept into him. Let's make sure that we're not so into the world that it's into us. Verse 9, and they, that is the men of Sodom, said, stand back. And then they said, now they turn to each other and say, this one, I mean Lot, of course, came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Well, it seems that Lot had indeed tried to be a voice for reason to the people of Sodom, but they weren't having any of his moralizing. They wanted what they wanted, and they weren't going to tolerate anyone getting in the way. Several years ago now, I became distressed at the direction that my city was taking on a whole host of issues that I'm not going to go into here. Some of it was simple policy issues. Others were moral challenges I was concerned about. And so I ran for city council. I hoped to be a voice of reason in city affairs. And not surprisingly, I lost to the longtime incumbent. More recently, following the Dobbs decision of the Supreme Court that overturned Roe versus Wade, my city proposed a resolution to declare itself an abortion sanctuary. A huge number of pro-life advocates turned out to the city council meeting to urge the council that the resolution be turned down. Unsurprisingly, there were not a few pro-abortion advocates there as well. What surprised me was the hostility abortion supporters showed toward those who were pro-life. The mad-dogging stares and the whispered comments made to those of us who were pro-life was frankly frightening. It put me in mind of what we find here in Genesis 19, the lust-grazed men of Sodom standing at Lot's door. We read on, now we will deal worse with you than with them. And so they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. But the men, and that means, of course, the angels, reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. The lust of the Sodomites was hot. They were in no mood to bargain. They're done with Lot and his moralizing ways, and so they bum rush him. And that's when the angels go to work. They reach out, drag Lot to safety, then miraculously thwart the attacker's ability to find the door, who eventually give up and wander off. Verse 12. Then the men, and again, that's the angels, said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, take them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters and said, "Get up and get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city." But to his sons-in-law, he seemed to be joking. So the behavior of the Sodomites that night was the proverbial tipping point. The angels warn Lot of God's judgment. It will proceed. Now, we don't know if Lot's sons-in-law were the guys who had been betrothed to his virgin daughters, or if Lot had other married daughters. The point is, when Lot tried to persuade them to join him in leaving Sodom, they didn't take him seriously, and no amount of pleading could convince them to listen. How sad when God's people lose credibility because of their own moral compromise. Lot's failure to influence his own family resulted from his compromised life and backslidden heart. May that be a solemn warning to all of us, and especially to parents. As we read the next verses, take note of the reluctance in Lot's household. Verse 15, when the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city." And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and the Lord, being merciful to him, and brought him out and set him outside the city. Question. If an angel told you your county was going to be devastated by a massive earthquake in 6 hours, would you dawdle? Would you fuss over what to do? Or would you throw some clothes and some waters into a bag, hop in your car, and head for safety as fast as you could? That's not Lot's reaction. He lingered. What's happened to him? Why would Lot linger in a place that he knows is about to be turned into ash? Well, simple. Instead of being an influence for God on Sodom, it's the other way around. Sodom's influenced Lot and numbed him to God. He's become so attached to his life in Sodom, he's reluctant to depart. He's compromised. We call Lot's spiritual condition backslidden. Verse 17, so it came to pass when they had brought them outside that he said, "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed." So the angels had to physically move Lot's family. Verse 16 says that they took them by the hand. Verse 17, that they brought them out. Then, when they stood there, shuffling their feet in reluctance, the angel said, "Get out of here." That phrase, "don't look back nor stay here," it was a rebuke to their lingering reluctance. Now, you've probably seen movies where someone stands where doom is about to fall. Though they can't hear us, we yell at the screen, "Move, you fool!" But they just stand there. Well, that's Lot, his wife, and his daughters. They hesitate because it's hard for them to believe in the fire that's about to fall and consume their city. They've never seen that, and so it's hard for them to, believe. What they have seen and known for years is who and what they've been in Sodom. That's it's their identity. Yes, there are problems in Sodom. They would admit that. It's not perfect, but it's what they know, and it's what they're comfortable with. It's easier for them to hang on to that than to let go and trust God to forge a new identity for them in the hills. So, verse 18, then Lot said to them, "Please, no, my lords." Now, watch this next part. Lot admits that he gets what's going on and that these angels are trying to protect him. He understands that God is being merciful to him. Verse 19, "Indeed, now your servant has found favor in your sight." And the question is, did he deserve that favor? No. its grace. We read on, and you have increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life. The increase in mercy came when they dragged him out of Sodom. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, this city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Please let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. And he said to him, see, I have favored you concerning this thing also, and that I will not overthrow this city for which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore the name of that city was called Zoar. Zoar means little one. The angels told Lot to head for the hills because God's judgment was going to fall on the plain. Lot protested and argued with them. So a free bit of advice. It's a bonus for watching the Into His Image YouTube channel. Don't argue with angels. They're messengers of God. When they tell Lot to take refuge in the hills, he replies, no, hills are dangerous. Listen, if an angel says that safety is in the hills, that's where you want to be. Lot is seriously confused. The real danger lies in the cities of the plain, but he begs for permission to go to one of them, Zoar. He points out that it's small. How bad can it be? It's tiny. Remember that Abraham asked God to spare Sodom if 10 righteous people could be found there. He based his request on the knowledge that God is righteous and wouldn't judge the righteous with the wicked. The angel says they can't drop judgment on these wicked cities until the righteous are gone. Verse 23, the sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. So they left Sodom before dawn. By the time they reach Zoar, the sun is up. Verse 24, then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. And so he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. So even as God mobilized nature in this fiery conflagration, it was at his word and his divine timing. The lesson lies in what happened to Lot's wife. Verse 26 links to 17, where the angel warned them not to hesitate in their haste to flee judgment. They told Lot's family to hustle, not lag. And that's exactly what Mrs. Lot did. The words of verse 26 don't mean that she, kind of looked back over her shoulder as they neared the gate of Zoar to see what was happening. This isn't a mistaken and brief glance at the Medusa that turns someone to stone. Mrs. Lot wasn't with Lot and her daughters. She is way behind them, dragging her feet rather than hustling to get to safety. At some point, she turned around away from Zoar to stare longingly back at Sodom. She started the journey to safety, but stalled before she got there. She's still standing in the territory that was doomed to judgment rather than the place of God's mercy and grace. And so when judgment fell, it fell on her too. Jesus used this story from Genesis as a lesson in how we are to live today. In Luke 17, speaking about the end times and what will be happening on earth as his return nears, he says this in verse 28. Likewise, as it was in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. For the vast majority of the world, it'll be business as usual when the day of the Lord commences and Jesus steps demonstrably into history by rapturing the church. Just as Lot went out and judgment came down, so the church will exit and then judgment falls in the horrors of the tribulation. It's at that point that once the church is gone, God turns his redemptive focus back to the Jews in Israel. That's who's in view, as Jesus goes on to say in verse 31, in that day, that is the rapture, when God's people are taken out of the place of judgment as Lot was. In that day, he was on the housetop and his goods are in the house. Let him not come down to take them away. And likewise, the one who is in the field, let him not turn back. Now, in Matthew's account, Jesus tells the Jews there to get out of Jerusalem as soon as possible because of what's coming. Just as Lot's family was to jam out of Sodom, they're to skedaddle from Jerusalem. Lot's family didn't. They lagged, trying to hang on to their old life, what they were familiar with, though it was about to be nuked. Jesus uses that old story in his warning and then says, verse 32, remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. While what Jesus says here applies specifically to the Jews during the tribulation, it speaks to us as well. Just as the angels announced judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, God's declared global judgment for the end of the age. He's given harbingers, signs to alert us to the imminence of his return. You don't have to be a Bible scholar to realize that for the first time in history, fanciful interpretations of prophecy are no longer needed. The world stage is set, geopolitically, economically, technologically, and spiritually for the tribulation. Judgment is coming. Before it can, God will take his people out, as he did Lot. So, remember Lot's wife. Christian, don't lag. Don't look with longing back on the good old days in the world. Put away defining yourself by the marks and measures of worldly success. This world is not your home. You were made for heaven. So stop looking back. Rather, look up. Look ahead to what you were created for, which is the glory of heaven. In 2 Peter chapter 2, we find this. God delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Now we ask, righteous Lot? Well, that's what God's word calls him. His faith in God was far from perfect, but it was real enough to shift him from judgment to mercy. Now, Peter says that Lot hated the wickedness of Sodom, but apparently he loved its prosperity and luxury. He had a nice home, a comfortable position there. The Sodom scene was obscene, but it's what Lot was used to, and he was loath to leave. Lot's a classic example of someone who has too much of God to be happy in the world, but too much of the world to be content in God. He hated the immorality, but he loved the amenities. God's judgment meant an end, not just to Sodom's wickedness, but to his cozy spot in it. Instead of celebrating God's mercy that was saving him, he was bummed by God's judgment, ending his comfort. If we're not careful, we'll end up a lot like Lot, decrying the immorality surrounding us, but are we ready for the many changes that a genuine revival would bring? Are we ready for the Holy Spirit to convict us at such a deep level that we repent of the carnality and worldliness of our lives? Are we ready to change what we watch, listen to, read, wear, laugh at, and are entertained by? Or do we, like Lot, when the angels told him to head for the hills, argue and bargain? Not the hills. How about little Zoar? Not holiness. How about just less sin? The people of God are constantly challenged with the choice of two loves. Two suitors vie for our affection, God and the world. We must choose between them because we cannot live for both. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17 says this, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world, well, that's passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah were wiped out, so too the world system in opposition to God will pass away. All that's been invested in it will disappear. Loving the world leads to irreparable loss, but loving God yields eternal reward. Jesus spoke of these two great loves in Matthew chapter 6 when he said, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon is not just money. It's the world system that uses money as a means of power. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon of August 24th of 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius on the west coast of Italy erupted. It threw a column of ash high into the sky that returned to blanket the surrounding countryside. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were swiftly covered by a foot of hot ash. And people rushed to get away as the ash continued to spew from the volcano. But most stayed, hoping that the eruption would end. Sometime that night, it betrayed their hope and began pouring pyroclastic flows of superheated rock gas mixture down its side into the cities. Those flows knocked down buildings and suffocated those who had stayed. By the next evening, Vesuvius was spent and the flow stopped. But Pompeii and Herculaneum were ghost towns. Nothing remained alive. All that was left were the ash-encrusted casts of those who'd stayed. Now, archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of them, and many of them tell an interesting tale. One was the mummified body of a woman whose lower body faced the door of her home as though ready to flee, but her upper body was twisted around as she reached for something on a shelf behind her. Her fingers just touched a bag of pearls. At that moment, the pyroclastic cloud blew through and killed her, wrapping around and preserving her form for nearly 2,000 years. Vesuvius' eruption wasn't without warning. Earthquakes had been shaking the region in both AD 62 and 63, leveling both of the cities. But they rebuilt because the land was good and was a good harbor. In the early months of 79, earthquakes started up again. They got progressively worse. And then smoke started billowing out of the top. Trees died on the hill's sides from the noxious fumes that were being released. All of that weeks before the eruption that killed thousands. Now, a few took heed. They fled. But the majority stayed and died. What's crazy is that Vesuvius is still an active volcano. It overlooks the modern city of Naples. Some people never learn. May that not be said of us. As Jesus said, remember Lot's wife. Let's put the lesson that she teaches to good use. Christian, don't lag. Don't hang back, trying to hang on to the old life and identity that Jesus died to deliver you from. Real life is ahead of you. It's not behind you. Stop arguing with the spirit that's calling you to the hills. Don't bargain yourself into a miserable compromise. Verse 27, and Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. Then Lot went up out of Zoar, and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him. For he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, and he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. When Lot saw the devastation of the other cities, he grew fearful and decided, to head for the hills where the angels had originally told him to go. And now we have another tragic twist in an already tragic story. Verse 31, now the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there's no man on the earth to come in to us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we may lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. So this place that they are in now is a remote area, and everything in the field of their vision has been, smoked. They assume it's the end of the world and that they are all that's left. Hey, listen, if the Rift Valley that the cities sat in had just dropped a dozen feet and there'd been a massive explosion, as the archaeology and geology of the area may hint at, it's not difficult to see why they drew that conclusion. It's what they do about it that is super sketchy. But why are they in such a rush? Why not talk to their father and make a plan? They seem almost eager to rush into this, which is just really gross. Verse 33, and so they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Now, hold on. If Lot is so drunk that he doesn't know what's happening, how is he able to, do this? Something fishy's going on here. Verse 34, it happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drunk with wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Then they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Now, twice it says that Lot was oblivious. So That's what we're left with. He's just out of it. But again, if he was that far gone in drink, how was he able to impregnate his daughters? The whole thing is really suspicious. Verse 36, thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He's the father of the Moabites to this day. And the younger, she also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He's the father of the people of Ammon to this day. Now, keep in mind that the law against incest wouldn't come until later, when the genetic stock of the human race was far more sorted out and flawed enough that the union of close relatives was dangerous. But sex between a parent and a child, that's always taboo. That's made clear by Lot's daughters, needing to get him drunk before they can carry out their plan. Lot and his family teach us that compromise and accommodation to the world lead to all kinds of problems. One commentator remarked, quote, ironically, in his drunkenness, Lot carried out the shameful act he'd suggested to the men of Sodom. He lay with his own daughters, unquote. The Moabites and Ammonites, they become serious trouble for the descendants of Abraham later on. As we end this episode, I want to take a moment to investigate some recent archaeological work that's been done in an attempt to locate Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, for decades, the conventional thought was that Sodom and Gomorrah and their sister cities were located at the southern end of the Dead Sea area. But recently, attention has shifted to the northern end and the site of Tall el Hammam as the site of ancient Sodom. There are some interesting aspects of that site to commend as Sodom, but it's, of course, not without controversy. I'm going to include some links to the articles if you're interested in investigating this on your own.